Hi, today we're going to be doing a short module on personality, what it means, and specifically how we can apply an understanding of personality to an understanding of political psychology. First of all, personality could be understood as being more fixed or stable versus more fluid and changing or responsive to the environment that we're in. We can also think of it as something that may just change over time or be relatively knowable or unknowable. Lewis Carroll says, I knew who I was this morning, but I have changed a few times since then. Nietzsche suggests that personality is something that exists, that is more fixed and more knowable, but not by individuals themselves. He says, what have we really just experienced? And more, who are we really? We count after the fact, all the 12 trembling strokes of the clock of our experience, our lives, our being, alas. In the process, we keep losing count. So we remain necessarily strangers to ourselves. We do not understand ourselves. We have to keep ourselves confused. For us, this law holds for all eternity. Each man is furthest from himself. Where we ourselves are concerned, we are not knowledgeable people. The protagonist from the film Saturday Night and Sunday Morning takes the opposite view, still suggesting that ourself is something that exists, but that others can't know it, only we have access to that information. He says, I'm me and nobody else, and whatever people think I am or say I am, that's what I'm not, because they don't know a bloody thing about me. So who are we? Who has that information, and why does that information matter? When we think about personality, when we try to make assessments of personality, whether others are or our own, in some ways we're trying to peer into the mind of this person. And we do that largely through trying to make attributions of individuals' behaviors, either external attributions, where we locate the source of the behavior in something that's external to the individual, for example, the situation that they're in, the forces that are working on them, something outside of themselves that is eliciting this behavioral response. Or we might make internal attributions and locate the source of the behavior within the individual. And when we do that, we're expecting that individual to behave that way in a variety of situations. We're seeing that behavior not as coming from the situation itself, but from the individual, as something that the individual brings to the situation. So in both cases, we're really trying to make predictions about what may happen, either what an individual will do in a given situation, how an individual is likely to behave across situations, or how different individuals are likely to behave in a particular situation. And when we're thinking about these things, it can be helpful to keep in mind Kelly's covariation model, which suggests that we look at 3 different kinds of information in order to make internal versus external attributions. First kind is consensus information. So this is information about how other people behave in response to the same stimulus. There's distinctiveness information, which refers to how an individual responds to different stimuli, and consistency information, which has to do with how frequently or how consistently over time an individual responds to the same or similar stimuli. To give an example of the kind of consensus information I'm talking about, I want you to imagine different people responding to a bear attack. All of them are likely to feel scared, scream, and run away. There's high consensus here. So what we're really getting information about is what it's like to be in the middle of a bear attack. We make an external attribution in this case, thinking that this fearful, running, screaming behavior is attributable to the situation rather than to these individuals. When we think about distinctiveness information, we could think about someone who is generally very kind, but maybe is mean to one person in a particular situation. If that's the case, that meanness would have high distinctiveness, and we would be likely to make an external attribution, thinking that this person's meanness in this particular situation is attributable to the situation, maybe to the person they're interacting with, rather than to the individual, him or herself. When we look at this person's generally kind behavior across situations with different individuals, where there's low distinctiveness, we're likely to make an internal attribution and think that this kind behavior is coming from the individual, that it's a personality characteristic. And when we think about consistency information, we can use the same example and think about this person being kind as a child, kind as a teenager, as an adult, as an older adult, and feel like we have pretty reliable information in this situation of high consistency, that we can make an internal attribution and assume that this kindness is, again, coming from within the individual, that it's part of their personality. So I'm going to talk about two different models of personality, and then I'm going to relate them to research on political behavior and ideological differences. So the first is infant temperament, and we can think about infant temperament sort of as baby personality. Considering that infants haven't been around too long, their tendencies, the tendencies that they display, are understood as being constitutionally based, in large part, at least when we talk about temperament. They are differences that emerge early in life, and they're differences in emotional, motor, and attentional reactivity and self-regulation, or in other words, an infant's ability to regulate their level of arousal, to modulate it up or down. And these differences in temperament tend to be fairly consistent across situations and relatively stable over time. There are 6 dimensions of infant temperament, and for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on 2 of them, specifically the 2 that we're going to discuss later when we talk about the political psychology research. The first is fearful distress, and the second is attention span and persistence. So when we talk about fearful distress, we're talking about things like how likely an infant, or how many times over the past week an infant cried or showed distress in response to a loud sound or a change in parent's appearance, or for a child, whether that child is afraid of large dogs or other animals or loud noises. So in other words, how likely is this infant or child to feel fear, to respond with fear in a given situation, or to experience fear-based distress. And when we talk about attention span, we want to know things like how often during the last week an infant looked at pictures in books or magazines for 5 minutes or longer, or played with a toy or an object for 10 minutes or longer, or for a child, whether they show strong concentration when they're drawing or coloring in a book, or whether they become very involved and work for long periods when they're building or putting something together. The Big Five, or the 5-factor model of personality, is the dominant one in political psychology, and came to exist through iterations of research that allowed researchers to identify these 5 dimensions that give us access to, in theory, kind of all the overarching aspects of an individual's personality. So these dimensions are orthogonal, meaning that they are not related to one another. In other words, having information about one dimension, one trait, doesn't give you any information about the likelihood of someone being high or low on a different trait. And they have subtraits that we can get into detail with, but these are the overarching categories of traits. We're going to stay there for today for the sake of time. We're going to focus again specifically on 2 of them. So the 5 traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And we're going to focus on openness and conscientiousness to be able to relate those to ideological differences later. So openness is the tendency for someone to be more imaginative, higher on imagination, feelings, actions, and ideas. So those who have a low score are more likely to be more practical, conventional, and prefer routine, whereas those with a high score on openness are more likely to be more curious, have a wider range of interests, and be more independent. Conscientiousness, on the other hand, has to do with competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, and being goal-driven, and individuals who are lower on conscientiousness are more likely to be more impulsive, more careless, and disorganized, whereas those who are higher on conscientiousness are more likely to be more hardworking, dependable, and organized. So we're now going to relate these 2 models, temperament on the one hand and the 5-factor model of personality on the other, to findings in political psychology. So this work of relating personality characteristics to ideological differences is based on a tradition, a history of and growing body of research, finding that When people differ on ideology, these differences in ideologies are correlated with factors that extend beyond the political realm. And so this was captured early on, before the term political psychology was even coined back in 1950 by Adorno et al., who said ideologies have, for different individuals, different degrees of appeal, a matter that depends upon the individual's needs and the degree to which these needs are being satisfied or frustrated. In other words, he's suggesting that different ideologies have offer different things, and that which ideology an individual holds is going to depend, to a certain extent at least, on what sort of person that individual is and what's going to be more appealing to that person. Jost builds on this idea many years later, saying heightened epistemic motives to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity and attain a sense of order, structure, and closure should favor the adoption of conservative, rightist attitudes that serve to preserve the status quo. To embrace the vicissitudes of liberal ideology, which emphasizes equality, progress, diversity, and tolerance of differences, one must be willing to accept, psychologically speaking, some degree of uncertainty, complexity, novelty, and ambiguity. So you may see where I'm going with this, that we can expect, in personality terms, those who are more open to be more likely to be liberal, and those who are more conscientious to be more likely to be conservative. But first, we'll talk about differences in temperament and how those relate to ideology. So this work, again, is based on this idea of there being certain personality-related antecedents of political orientation. And this particular paper by Wegemer and Vandal looks at the early childhood antecedents of adult political orientation. So using longitudinal data that had started to be collected when these individuals were children and had waves of data collected throughout their lives, looked at associations between parenting beliefs and behaviors, child temperament, and attachment security during early childhood in relation to the adult political ideology and party affiliation of these participants when they were 26 years old. And they found what we might expect, which was that children's fearful temperament as children predicted their adult conservative political orientations, whereas their ability to focus attention predicted liberal orientations. The fearful temperament aspect may be a little easier to understand here, since, as we just saw, conservatism offers individuals a degree of order and security and certainty that may be more appealing to those with a more fearful temperament or who are more likely to become afraid in response to various stimuli, including changes in society. In order to understand this association between the ability to focus attention and liberal orientation, that one may be a bit harder to understand, and we won't get into the mechanisms at this point, but we can think of that in terms of the degree of complexity and change that tend to go along with a liberal ideology, and the ability to focus attention may make processing that volume and that complexity of information more appealing and perhaps also easier, which is in line with research showing that liberals or leftists are higher in need for cognition, meaning that they enjoy processing information and engaging in more cognition, and lower in need for closure, meaning that they derive less pleasure from coming to a conclusion and setting a matter aside, and that they are less uncomfortable with having matters stay open. So now we're going to move on to the Big Five, also known as OCEAN for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, personality traits, and how they relate to ideology. So again, the hypothesis here is that left-right differences are rooted in basic personality dispositions that make certain ideologies more appealing to some individuals than others. And here, Carney et al. Used 3 different measures to assess personality traits. So they didn't just rely on self-reported personality assessment, or in other words, individuals' responses to a scale measuring to what degree they held certain personality traits. They also used nonverbal behavior in the context of a social interaction, where these interactions were recorded. It was a participant interacting with a Confederate who was working with the researchers. And then the participants' behavior in these video interactions were coded for specifically openness, and they were coded for all 5 of these personality traits, but here we'll be looking at openness and conscientiousness. And in addition, their personal possessions and the characteristics of their living and working spaces were assessed for cues of these personality traits, including the kinds of books that they may have had out, how organized and clean their rooms and their offices were, etc. And so once again, here we find that liberals are higher on openness. They're more open-minded, creative, curious, and novelty-seeking, whereas conservatives were found to be higher on conscientiousness, meaning they were more orderly, conventional, and better organized. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a discussion of how the Big Five personality traits predict not only political ideology, but specifically how the Big Five personality traits interact with experiences that individuals have over their lifetime, including as children, in order to predict their ideology later in life. And so usually in social psychology, when we talk about the person by situation interaction, we're talking about how the personality traits that you have or something about the individual will kind of push them in one direction or another in a certain situation. So rather than assuming that having some characteristic will always necessarily make an individual act in the same way, or alternatively, that everyone will act the same in a given situation, we assume that there's going to be some kind of interaction between those two factors, so that people who are one way are more likely to behave in a certain way in a situation, and people who are a different way are more likely to behave in a different way in that situation. Here, we're specifically looking at we're not looking at how an individual, based on their personality, is more likely to behave in a situation given that aspect of their personality, but actually how their personalities are likely to develop when their current personality runs up against some kind of experience, and how that predicts change in some other aspect of who they are. So specifically here, we're looking at Big Five personality traits, and we're going to be focusing on openness and how that interacts with having experienced trauma during childhood in order to predict political ideology. So Deneve once again finds that openness predicts liberal ideology and conscientiousness predicts conservative ideology. But he also finds that there's this interaction effect between openness and childhood trauma that makes it an individual even more likely to have liberal ideology as an adult. So in other words, being higher on openness already predicts a higher likelihood of liberal ideology. But when an individual is high on openness and experiences childhood trauma, that essentially magnifies the likelihood that they will have a liberal ideology later. And there are various possibilities for why this might be. It may be that the experience of being vulnerable and being harmed sensitizes people to the vulnerability of all individuals and makes a stronger government more appealing. There are various possibilities that we're not going to go into for the sake of time right now. But what I want to focus on is the fact that, as we discussed earlier in this presentation, there are different ways of understanding personality. It's in some ways up for debate, or has been, how fixed or stable personality is, how much it can tell us about what an individual is likely to do, how different events are likely to affect an individual, and who has access to this information. And these studies, as a body, have shown us that not only can we know something about our own personalities, and not only can other people assess our personalities from the outside, but that who we are, the traits that we have, can predict other important aspects of our behavior and of ourselves, including ones that may seem at first glance not to be related, like our political ideologies. And that our personality characteristics not only predict those other traits or those other tendencies that we might have, they can also predict how experiences that we live through are likely to affect us and affect those traits. So I hope that you've enjoyed this short presentation, and thanks for watching.